What is going on, guys? Thank you for entering the chamber once again. Today I've got a fresh deck profile for you, and the good news is that with rotation looming, while this deck profile is not perfect going through rotation, it does lose a couple cards, it is definitely rotation resistant. This is absolutely a deck that you could pick up and play with for the next at least a year and change and feel very confident in it. I think this is a competitive deck with a competitive character. It does require some practice and getting used to. We're going to spend some time talking about that because this deck is a little more complicated and a little bit more pilot intensive than some of the other decks I've shown in the past. And we're talking about the one, the only Mimic. For those that don't know, Mimic comes with 3 abilities. He has a permanent that basically says that you can use assets like their foundations once per check. And that's the main reason you play with this character. Because you get to absolutely cheat on your ratios when it comes to deck building. We play almost as many assets as we do foundations. And then he has 2 responses, both incredibly useful. The first one says that when you check an asset once per turn, you can get any attack with a control of 3 from your discard pile. So you can't like pick up 1s and 2s. You can't cheese that. So we don't play those. We're we only play 3s in this deck. But you can pick up basically any attack from your discard pile, and like we'll talk about it. But there's some really messed up things you can do with that grab. And then the second response is that when you commit an asset, which includes when you're passing a check, you give the current attack either +2 or -1 damage. We have a lot of ways to take advantage of and abuse that. When we talk about the cards in this deck, usually I like to go through the attacks and then I go through the foundations. We're going to open with things in a slightly different order, actually, and we're going to start by talking about our playset of training weights. Training Weights is a promo card. It's a little older, but it's not quite a set 1 card. It's actually a Heroes Clash card, this is the main reason why this deck is works through rotation. When we hit rotation, this card sticks. So the way Weights works is that you can commit it to give the current attack a damage, and then commit a foundation or discard a momentum to ready it. The next time you do that, it gets 2 damage, and then you could ready it again, and then it gets 3 damage, and 4 damage, and 5 damage, so on and so forth. Mimic, because he gives an extra 2 damage when you commit an asset, what this works out to is that you commit for start at 3, and then 4, and then 5 damage, which is huge values. If you have multiple of these out, even if you've only been racking up like 1 weights over an attack string, so 3, 4, 5, on your 4th move, here's 6 damage, here's 9, 12, 15, like you get to huge damage values. One of the things I love about Mimic is that this guy can kill people, and it's all thanks to training weights. That brings us to the best attack in the deck, a playset of Electromagnetic Stomp. This is the #1 attack that you're going to kill people with in this deck. It's not Tongue Whip. Spoilers, we're playing Tongue Whip. It's not even Trigger Transformation, which we'll get to later. It's this card right here. This card says it's a 4 low for 4 on a 4 diff. I'm telling you, this card is like a 3 difficulty, like 4 low for 15, 17, 20. Like, card gets giant. In addition to having stun 1, which is sometimes useful, the main reason this card is sick is because we can pay 2 life and just ready an asset. We get a lot of value out of that because readying an asset is like readying a foundation for us. So this is like a free use of training weights, which is useful like in bigger strings. If you check poorly to play this card, you can commit a asset as part of passing the check, and then just pay 2 life and ready the asset. So it's like it's a 3 diff, and you still get the damage. So if you commit an asset to pass this card, this is a 4 low for 6. You cut 2 life, you get to ready the asset you use to pass the check. Super good, super sick. Easily the best attack on the deck. I'd play like 6 of this card if I could. Next up, another asset. We play a playset of Box Full of Babies. Box Full of Babies is like a one-time use training weights for tech or weapons, which primarily will work off of Electromagnetic Stomps. Stomp is the main card that we pump with this. but it also lets us draw and discard cards when we're going through our deck on kill turns. We only play 16 attacks in this deck, and it's a 60 card deck list, so we play a very low attack percentage. So sometimes you're like an attack away. If you have a few boxes, being able to like draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards, in addition to the attack pickup from your character, I've gotten kills on people where I played 4 or 5 attacks and I started with like 2 in hand. Just from like checking an asset, draws here, a bit of card draw later. The fact that you can pick up Stomp, Electromagnetic Stomp, you can also pick it up from Momentum because it goes in Momentum face up. Like, you can literally, like, when it's time to kill someone, you can like finagle attacks out of nowhere. And Box helps with this. And then once you get to boot, you commit these. Each one of these commits for a speed and a damage. Because we also get our character. This is a speed and 3 damage, 2 speed and 6, 3 and 9, etc. Like, again, just giant values. On to the rest of the attacks. We play a playset of Vile Seasoning. There's a sub-theme in this deck of hitting our opponent with Breaker on almost every block that we hit them with. And part of that comes from Vile Seasoning. Seasoning is just a powerful card on its own because it's usually a 3 high for 6 that draws us a card, which is good value. Because we're a string deck, we care more about the damage and the draw than we do about it having low speed. The deadlock on it means that our opponent knows that in most situations they cannot afford to go to 11 against us because we will kill them on the backswing. You can open with a Vile Seasoning and they're going to die. There are decks that can play through the Deadlock Enhance on this card, but because of our asset and foundation lineup, which we'll talk about as we go through the deck, most of the decks that could otherwise play through this Deadlock Enhance usually can't unless they have like a truly insane amount of foundations, like 16, 17, 18. Most people are going to get stuck from this. Next, we play 3 copies of Trigger Transformation. Transformation is just a bomb. Sometimes it's nice being able to turn a spare momentum if we get like a poke in into another trigger. We'll talk about trigger later. But usually this is just a 4 difficulty, 5 mid for like 12 to 15 usually when I'm playing this card. It gets a damage for every asset that you have, and it loses the difficulty for every asset that you have. The difficulty is capped off at -3, so this card is very quickly a 4 difficulty move. The damage pump is unlimited. My record is 17. There was a game where I had 11 assets in play, and it got 11 damage off itself. And in that game, my opponent actually didn't have a mid, so they had to half block it, and they still took 9. And they ended up dying for it, so I got a little lucky on that one. This card is just a huge bomb, big stats, and it gets us Trigger, which is probably one of our best assets, like in the abstract. Not for killing people, but just in terms of raw value. Next, we play 3 copies of Tongue Whip. We kill people on the low block zone, but our moves are a little slow. Whip is an extra low threat, so we're kind of overloading people on the low block zone when it goes for going for kills. And then this move can also get pretty large since it gets damage equal to cards on our opponent's card pool, and it can still get big with weights. This is kind of like our backup Electromagnetic Stomp. We are losing this card, and I know this card is like a linchpin for most of its symbols in most decks. I'm gonna be honest. I mean, like, I'm gonna miss Tongue Whip, but we'll be this deck will be okay without Tongue Whip because we can kill people without it. I think there's a couple things that are worth looking at, like Inverted Knife Throw. Since the Inverted Knife Throw works out to just like free momentum, so you only have this for like another month, and you'll have to replace it with some kind of other like either like low or maybe high block. Anyways, yeah. So Tongue Whip was a great card. I will miss it, but losing it doesn't like break this deck like it like some people are worried about with Evil and other symbols. So that's always nice. The last thing we play is 2 copies of Chronostasis Trigger. This is probably the attack we grab the most with our character. I kind of wanted to play a 3rd, but I also like to keep my decks right at 60. And for the most part, I never had an issue finding this card, at least when I needed it. Because once you have one in the bin, you can just constantly pick it up and loop it. It's a Breaker 2 block. You can change the zone. If it connects, it seals your opponent's character, which can be like game winning. And then you get to like freeze pieces. The freeze actually has came up a couple of games. Again, we'll talk about when we get to the rest of these cards, but this is actually a control deck. So being able to like freeze a committed down card that I didn't want to deal with actually won me a couple games. I got a game against a Ryuku not too long ago at an event, just like a local thing, where I was able to freeze down a fast strength, which stopped them from A, being able to use it to kill me on their next turn, and then B, using it to blank my attacks when I killed them on the turn afterwards. So really, really sick card. We're actually going to go from here into the rest of the assets now, starting with a playset of Trigger. Trigger, put simply, counts as 3 foundations. It's an asset, so you can commit it to pass your checks. And then it also has a response that's playable while committed to give a check +1. So you can commit it for, passing a check. The +1 on your turn and the +1 on your opponent's turn. This is like having 3 foundations. The games where you open with 2 of these and build 2 triggers out the gate, you are like invincible. You have 6 foundations. Build a couple other foundations and 6 on blocks. Even when you're going second, you're already ahead of the game. It also comes with a really nifty second response where you can remove it, which is a very heavy cost. Like I said, it counts as 3 foundations. I would suggest you try to use the +1 before you let it get removed. You cut health, which is occasionally actually important in this deck. You then get to draw a card and then ready a foundation. The foundation ready isn't a big deal because most of our stage isn't that interesting, but that does work out to another free activation of training weights, since you can then use the weights, commit the foundation, you're ready to, ready the weights again. So that is still useful. And then sometimes you need the card draw and the health cut. All in all, this is an easy MVP. The Fat Trigger transformation can build this in with a momentum, won me games. This is a card I'd play like 6 or 7 copies of if I could. Next, this is a card that's probably going to surprise people we play so much of. We're playing a full playset. That's right, we're playing 4 copies of Twisty Surroundings. This card is messed up. I think, as a rule of thumb, even if you're not playing Mimic, you should be playing more of this card. The games where you build this on turn 1 over a foundation, you are invincible, even going second. This usually works out to your opponent has 2 less foundations to play attacks, or they just lose an attack flat out. Either way, depending on what you're trying to play against, the enhance here is incredibly good. In Mimic, it has the small extra upside of if they pass the check through the commit, that attack also comes in with -1 damage. It does also have, the response. It does also let either player discard a momentum to do zone changes. We don't care about that much in this deck because when we're killing people, they're out of resources typically. So even if they have momentum to change zones, they're not sticking blocks. For us, we don't get a lot of momentum in this deck with this build, but it's occasionally useful. We're really here for the response though, and for the Breaker 2. This is why we play 4 copies. We want to build it early. Extra copies, these are just Omni blocks. You are very happy with this character taking chip damage as long as it doesn't kill you. So even if you block like a high or a low, getting the Breaker 2 and trimming the damage that you take in, totally worth it. Next, we played 3 copies of League of Villains. 3 of this card probably looks like a lot, but you become an entirely, completely different character once you have a single copy of this out. And because we're only playing 16 attacks, we can afford to play a little greedier in the rest of our assets and foundations in terms of having enough cards we can build on turn 1. This card is basically an attack at the beginning of the game, so this is kind of like playing 19 attacks in a way. The response that burns your opponent for using an ability on a committed foundation comes up occasionally. The burn is minor, but it can kill people, so if you get them on like low health, it can be important. But the big thing is the ability to commit it, and then commit a foundation, and just say no to an enhance. There's so many good foundations that are seeing play right now. This lets you out Deadlock. This lets you out like frustrating attacks. Card was easily an MVP, and it actively made my opponents have to play differently without it. And every single time they failed to account for this card for a second, it killed them. The number of people that try to use like speed resets or damage resets on my moves to then die to League of Villains was like a lot. It happens a lot. That's actually it for the assets. We're going to now move on to the foundations, starting with a playset of Surviving the Final. Final's a little boring. It basically counts as 2 foundations for blocks, but that's kind of the name of the game here. Because assets don't count towards deadlock, but we can use them to pass checks, we kind of get like the best of both worlds. So this is like another way where we can push that further. You know, we're using assets to pass our checks, where you have foundations that count for 2 to pass our checks. It's very hard to push damage on this character. Next, we play 3 copies of Quick to Act. This is a character more than almost any other character where we're actually willing to half block stuff and give our opponent momentum. We play enough like counters and negates that usually we can play through the downside of half blocking moves, and we kind of want to push ourselves down to like 13 or 14 health. And then on kill turns, we can cut that last little bit of life to get to 12 and turn our Quick to Acts on to get in to make our moves like unblockable. The clapback on this deck is incredible. If your opponent waits around too long, you can just hit them with 6 attacks. Sometimes 7 attacks. That's a thing that can happen. So your opponent's in like a real lose-lose situation. Onto the ones, we play 3 copies of Shock Absorption. Deadlock isn't a major concern for us. It's something we kind of weaponize against our opponent. But sometimes if you see a lot more foundations than assets, you can get a little uncomfortably close. Shock Absorption just lets us not worry about that as much. You can destroy it while it's committed to give an attack -2 speed. So you can commit it once to pass an early block and then blow it up to guarantee you pass the next block. Card was fine. I can see Fiery Confrontation here if you wanted to be more controlling. The defense in this deck felt great either way. This card does leave in about a month, so when that happens, I imagine Fiery Confrontation will be the replacement here, unless we get a really good evil 1 diff with a decent mid block. Next up, we play 2 copies of No Remorse. No Remorse lets us flip to draw a card if our opponent has made 3 checks in this turn. Vile Seizing makes our opponent makes checks. We're actually playing a card in here that makes our opponent makes checks. A couple of cards, actually. So this condition is pretty trivial. We typically don't need a lot of card draw because our character literally picks up attacks. And then we have box full of babies to, draw 2 or 3 cards off the top. Granted, you have to discard cards afterwards, but you only do that when you're going for the kill. So discarding assets or foundations from our hand isn't really a cost. But sometimes you need to go just a little bit further, and having the spot draw was nice. Next, we play just a single copy of Mastermind's Apprentice. This is one of the other ways we had to control for deadlock and to make our attacks more lethal. It's pretty rare you get to use this card. There's a reason why I only play 1 of it, but it's nice having that little bit of insurance. Next up, we play 2 copies of In Control. In Control is both speed pump and speed reduction, and it gives us a bit of throw hate. The card's really flexible. It is a 4 check, which hurts a little bit because we're playing a couple other 4s like League of Villains. So I don't want to have too many of these. 2 felt just right. I could maybe have seen a 3rd, but I never felt like I was missing it. In the same vein, I'm playing 2 Cooperation Offer. Co-op Offer was great. It felt great every time I used it. I mean, everyone knows that this is a staple. I wouldn't have hated having a 3rd copy of this card, but I like to keep my decks right at 60. And that was one of the things I had to do to get down to 60. If you want to go to like 61 or 62, probably the first thing I would do is add a 3rd co-op offer. The card was very good. I never died because I didn't have it, but I definitely felt unsafe even on turns where I lived because I didn't have it, if that makes sense. Next, we're playing 2 copies of Apathetic, and now we're getting into some of the more control stuff. So we're already playing a lot of Breaker, which makes our opponent commit foundations or just give up attacking us. And then we have League of Villains as a constant, like, omni-block for strong effects. But sometimes our opponents have abilities that are repeatable. Things like Talented Baker, for example, or Dragon Strength, that we need to just get rid of. And Apathetic was great here. I would have loved to have played a 3rd copy of it, but, like I said, I like to keep my decks right at 60. The 4 was concerning. I didn't want to have too many of those. And ultimately, this is just spot removal for foundations. Card was great at 2. To further along with the control aspect, we're playing 3 copies of League Invitation. Invitation lets us, A, drive attacks home because we can commit it to reduce our opponent's next check, which means that they're going to fail their block, Or we can flip it and make our opponent check against a difficulty of 7, and they either have to pass that check, which again is losing foundations, which is tough in conjunction with the breaker and the cancels and the speed hate that we have. It's like a tough sell for them, or they have to commit a foundation of our choosing. So there were a lot of games where our opponents would go in, and once I felt that they were like in like a kind of safe position for me to kill them, I would flip a couple of league invitations and hit their last pieces of defense, and then hit them with a breaker block. And that would usually end their turn on the spot, and then I would kill them on the backswing. To help facilitate that game plan, the action we play, and you probably figured this, we play 3 copies of Barrier Shield. Mimic is a 6-hander, and usually Barrier Shield can be a little awkward in 6-handers because you are losing a card for the effect. But Mimic is really like an 8-hander because he picks up an attack on his turn and usually on his opponent's turn too. Sometimes you're only a 7-hander. But either way, that's enough where you can afford to play a Barrier Shield. And the games where like you go first and you build like a Twisty Surroundings and some cards, and then you build again on 2, your opponent attacks you on their turn 2, and you commit Twisty, they pass the check, they lose a couple foundations, and then you bury your shield and block their attack, their turn's over. They're not going to play another attack on a 7. They might not even pass it. It just ends their turn. And then from there you get like a 3rd turn to build, and you're like invincible at that point. It's very hard. Once you're like established and have foundations and assets, like this character is very hard to kill. It might take you a while to kill them, but you're like invincible. That completes my 60 card deck profile for Mimic. This is a deck list I am incredibly confident in. I think the character is competitive. I think this deck list is competitive. There's a couple of cards I could see some minor changes with on player preference, but I really don't think you need to change what you're doing. You can take this exact 60 cards, spend some time, practice it, learn the ins and outs, and you could have a lot of success with this. This is a deck list, even without a sideboard, that I could see taking down a PSC, or maybe with a little bit more practice and honing, theoretically topping like a major. Very competitive character, very competitive deck, very competitive symbol. Easily one of the best decks that I've showcased on the channel, and that I had an absolute blast playing this. If you enjoyed this deck profile and you're motivated to give Mimic a try, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons down below. It really helps me out, and I would appreciate that. That's going to wrap this video up, though, guys. So once again, thank you for entering the chamber, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.